Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Some men live their lives in the gray. Not good guys, not bad guys. Just survivors. Men who know the rules of the world are different depending on what side of the counter you're on. Sal was one of those men. For 40 years, he had run a small pawn shop on a forgotten street, a dusty museum of a neighborhood's broken dreams, gold chains, wedding rings, power tools, baby shoes. Every item had a story of a hope that had been pawned for a handful of cash. Sal was the keeper of those stories. He was an old man now, his hands gnarled, his eyes a deep and weary blue. He had seen it all. He had been a part of the streets his whole life, not as a banger, but as a businessman. His shop was a quiet and neutral ground, a place where the hustlers and the working stiffs could all come to turn their trouble into cash. He was a fence, of course. He knew that. He didn't ask where the jewelry came from, where the new TV had been acquired. He just bought and sold. It was a quiet and profitable kind of sin, a sin of a willful blindness. He had one friend left in the world, an old man named George. They had grown up together, two boys in a hard world. George had been a player in his day, a respected man on the streets. Now he was just an old man like Sal, living on his social security, his glory days a distant and faded memory. They would play chess in the back of the pawn shop every Tuesday, two kings in a kingdom of forgotten things. George had a grandson, a 17-year-old kid named Kevin. Kevin was a good kid, but he was lost. He was being raised by his grandmother, and the streets were a powerful and seductive father figure. He was running with a bad crowd, chasing a dream of a life that he only saw in music videos. Sal saw the worry in his friend's eyes. "He's a good boy, Sal," George would say. "He just needs a direction." And Sal would just nod, knowing that in their world, a boy without a direction is a boy who is already walking toward a cage or a grave. The day it all went wrong was a cold and gray Tuesday. George had just left the shop, his laughter still a warm echo in the dusty air. Sal was getting ready to close up. And then the bell over the door jingled. A kid in a hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows, walked in. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the shop. He came up to the counter and he pulled out a gun, a small, cheap-looking pistol. It was shaking in his hand. "Give me the money," the kid said, his voice a high and reedy squeak of a false bravado. Sal looked at the kid, at the gun. He wasn't scared. He had had guns pulled on him before. He just felt tired. "Son," he said, his voice a low and weary rumble, "you don't want to do this." But the kid was too far gone in his own and desperate fantasy. He waved the gun. "The money!" Now. Sal reached under the counter, not for the money, but for the old and heavy .38 he kept there for protection. He didn't want to use it, he just wanted to scare the kid off. But as he brought it up, the kid panicked. He lunged forward, trying to grab the gun. And in the struggle, in the clumsy and desperate dance of two scared men, the old .38 went off, a single and deafening roar in the small and quiet shop. The kid stumbled back, a look of a profound and final surprise on his face. He looked down at his chest, at the small and dark and blossoming flower of red. He looked back up at Sal. And then he just fell. A marionette with its strings cut. Sal stood there, the gun smoking in his hand, the smell of cordite sharp in the air. He looked down at the boy on the floor, and in that moment the hoodie fell back from his face, and Sal's world just ended. It was Kevin, George's grandson, the boy he had known since he was a baby, the boy he had just killed. The quiet and simple man who lived in the gray had just been plunged into a darkness from which there is no escape. The world went silent. The only sound in that dusty and forgotten shop was the frantic and useless pounding of Sal's own and broken heart. He stared down at the body of the boy he had just killed, Kevin, George's boy. The name was a silent scream in his mind. He didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. He just stood there, a ghost in the ruins of his own life. The gun fell from his numb hand, clattering on the floor with a sound that was too loud, too final. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a tragedy, a nightmare, and he was at the center of it. His first instinct, the one that had been honed by a lifetime of living in the gray, was to cover it up, to make the body disappear, to erase the mistake. But this wasn't a piece of stolen jewelry he could hide in a safe. This was a boy, a life, his best friend's grandson. He thought of George, of the pride in his eyes when he talked about Kevin, of the quiet and desperate hope he had for the boy. And a wave of a grief so profound, so absolute, washed over him. A grief that was not for himself, but for his friend. He had not just killed a boy. He had killed his friend's last and only dream. He knew he had to call the police. He knew he had to face the consequences. But he was a man who had lived his whole life in the shadow. And the thought of the bright and unforgiving glare of the law was a terrifying one. So he just sat there, on the floor of his dusty and silent shop, next to the body of the boy he had killed. And he waited. He waited for the world to come and claim him. It was a customer who found him, an old woman coming to pawn her late husband's watch. She opened the door and she screamed. And then the world came rushing in. The sirens, the police, the paramedics, the whole and chaotic and brutal machinery of death. They took him to the precinct, a quiet and stoic old man in a state of shock. He told them what had happened, the whole and ugly and tragic truth, the robbery, the struggle, the accident. They listened, their faces a mask of a professional and practiced sympathy, and then they made a call to George to tell him that his grandson was dead and that the man who had killed him was his best and oldest and only friend. Sal sat in that cold and sterile interrogation room, and he could hear in his mind the sound of his friend's world shattering. He had lived his life in the gray, a man who had thought he could profit from the darkness without being consumed by it. But the darkness had finally and brutally come home, and it had taken everything. The wheels of justice are a slow and grinding and indifferent thing. Sal was charged with manslaughter. The DA knew it was a robbery gone wrong, a self-defense claim waiting to happen. But a boy was dead, and someone had to pay. Sal sat in the county jail, a ghost in a world he had only ever seen from the other side of the counter. He didn't care about the charges, about the sentence. His own and personal sentence was being served in the quiet and torturous confines of his own mind. He saw Kevin's face in his dreams, the look of a shocked and final surprise, and he thought of George, his friend, his brother, the man whose heart he had broken. George didn't come to see him. He didn't answer his calls. The silence from his friend was a punishment far more brutal than any cage. It was a silence that was filled with a lifetime of a shared and now shattered history. The day of the funeral, Sal sat in his cell, and he mourned alone. He mourned for the boy he had killed, and he mourned for the friend he had lost. The trial was a quiet and somber affair. Sal didn't fight the charges. He took the stand and he told the truth, the whole and ugly and tragic story. He looked out at the gallery and he saw him, George, sitting in the front row, his face a mask of a quiet and profound and bottomless grief. Their eyes met for a brief and painful moment, and in that one single and devastating look, Sal saw the full and terrible scope of the wreckage he had caused. The judge was a kind and weary old man. He saw the tragedy of it all. The two old friends, the lost boy, the stupid and pointless violence. He sentenced Sal to 10 years. A light sentence for a life that was taken. But for a man in his 70s, it was a life sentence. He was going to die in a cage. As they led him away, he looked at George one last time, but his friend was already gone. He had slipped out of the courtroom, a ghost, disappearing back into a world that had lost all of its color. Sal had lived his life in the gray, and now he was going to a world of black and white, a world of concrete and steel, a world where there was no room for ambiguity, just the cold and hard and unforgiving truth of his own and final mistake. Walking into the state penitentiary is a different kind of death. It's the death of your name, of your past, of your future. You become a number, a ghost, a part of the great and grinding machine. Sal was an old man, and he walked onto that yard like a man walking to his own and final grave. He was a fish out of water. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't hard. He was just an old man. And the predators on the yard could smell the weakness. But he had a strange and unexpected kind of protection. His name, his reputation from the streets, the old heads in the prison, the ones who had been around, they knew who he was. They knew his shop. They knew his story. And they knew he had been a man of a quiet and steady honor in his own and gray way. So they left him alone. He was a relic from a bygone era, a ghost of a code that was long dead. And they gave him a quiet and grudging respect. He did his time in a quiet and solitary hell of his own making. He worked in the prison library, surrounded by the stories of other men's lives, while his own was a constant and looping nightmare. He saw Kevin's face in every young inmate he passed, and he thought of George every single day. He wrote to him once a week, long and rambling letters of apology, of regret. They all came back unopened. The silence from his friend was a wall he could not break through. He was a man, serving 2 sentences, the one the judge had given him, and the one his own and broken heart had given him. A life sentence of a profound and unending loneliness, and on the outside, George was serving a life sentence of his own. The death of his grandson at the hands of his best friend had shattered him. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the empty rooms of his small house, his only companion the ghosts of his own, and happy past. He kept Sal's letters, the unopened ones, in a box under his bed. A box of a pain he could not bring himself to face. 2 old men, 2 brothers, on opposite sides of a wall, both of them trapped in the same and tragic and lonely prison of the past. Years in a cage have a way of wearing a man down to his essential truth. For Sal, that truth was a profound and quiet and unending sense of remorse. He was a man who was living a life of amends in the only way he knew how. He became a mentor to the younger inmates, a quiet and steady presence in the chaos of their lives. He used his own and tragic story as a cautionary tale, a story about the true cost of a life in the gray. And on the outside, George was on his own and slow and painful journey. The anger that had been a fire in his heart had cooled over the years, leaving only a cold and gray ash of a profound and weary sadness. He started to go to a support group for families of victims of violence. And in that circle of other broken hearts, he found a small and fragile measure of peace. One day, he took the box of unopened letters from under his bed, and he started to read. He read the story of his friend's own and profound and unending grief. He saw not a monster, but a man, a broken and old and lonely man, just like him. And in that moment of a shared and tragic humanity, the wall of his own and righteous anger finally crumbled. He wrote back, a short and simple letter. "I forgive you, Sal," he wrote, "and I hope wherever you are that you can find a way to forgive yourself." The letter arrived at the prison on a Tuesday, the same day of the week that the world had ended all those years ago. Sal read the words, and for the first time in a decade, he wept. Not tears of grief, but tears of a quiet and profound and miraculous grace. The two old friends, the two brothers, started to write. They rebuilt their friendship letter by letter across the vast and indifferent expanse of the prison system. They were two old men at the end of their lives, finding their way back to each other in the ruins of their shared and tragic past. And in that, they both found a kind of redemption, a quiet and hard-won and profoundly beautiful peace, a peace that had been bought and paid for with a price that was almost too high to bear, the price of a young boy's life and the tears behind the pawn shop counter. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.